Let's stay away from that territory. Welcome to Libero. This is our 10th episode, I think. And as you can see, we're already starting to feel the pace. Jonathan Wilson is joining me. He is not very well, so he would like your sympathy and also your admiration for soldiering on. Hello, Jonathan.
Hello, Rory.
And I'm also joined by Tariq Panja of the New York Times, who I think is in good health.
At the moment, yes, but if this computer virus is anything to go by, mate, might not be by the end of it.
That's true. We're all taking a terrible risk. I'm actually broadcasting wearing a full hazmat suit, just in case. Today, we're going to be talking about the long tail of the early 2000s, the part of football history that I think has now been kind of characterised as the Barclaysman era, but I'm not sure whether that fully encapsulates it. And then we're going to ask whether Pep Guardiola is the end of history, but we'll get onto that later. The first element of our discussion today was inspired partly because I did an hour on the radio last night for the BBC on the fact that it is 20 years since Jose Mourinho won his first title with Chelsea. Did we know that it was an anniversary we were aware of?
I knew he won his first trophy with Chelsea in 2005. I was there, but no. What struck me, and this is, I realised everything I say now is just because I'm a 48-year-old man. I've become sort of utterly characteristic of 48-year-olds. That I was recording a podcast. It was what it was, football history podcast. Well worth listening to if you ever get bored of this.
Let's cross-pollinate the audiences.
On Heysel, which is the 40th anniversary is coming up the end of May, and I just couldn't get my head around the fact that from now to Istanbul is the same length of time as Istanbul to Heysel.
And from now to Heysel is the same length of time as Heysel to the end of the Second World War.
Yeah, I mean, I that seems easier to conceptualise, but like Istanbul feels like it happened a couple of years ago.
It's a fun game to play, that's all.
Yeah, and in between those two things, you have the 1965 FA Cup final where Leeds beat Liverpool.
Trying to think what's 80 years before 1945. My maths isn't very good.
1865. Is that
what happened?
Great
What happened in 1865?
Second Reform Act. The third Reform Act. Sorry,
the third Reform. I mean, come on, who can forget? But the fact that the BBC, the fact the BBC did this hour on Mourinho, it kind of, it was an example of something that we all know, and I think most fans who consume football with at least like a side order of the media will recognise, which is that we love an anniversary. Like newspapers, digital media, TV, radio, just love an anniversary. It's just easy. It's good, old-fashioned, harmless, easy content, and that's fine. But it also struck me as being quite a powerful example of the hold that period of football continues to exert over us. And it's not just in terms of that content creation. I think it's especially pronounced in punditry, where if you think of all the sort of voluble pundit class that we have, Gary Neville, Jamie Carragher, Thierry Henry, Micah Richards to an extent, even people like Robbie Mustoe and Robbie Earle, who are big in the States, they are all of that kind of late 90s, early 2000s period. That is the kind of, that was their prime, their imperial phase. And it's really kind of potent with the overlap, where the standing joke is, I wonder who the overlap will get on, and asked about the culture that Fergie built at Manchester United. Like, that is just a show about what Man United used to be like.
Can I just say though, what a great podcast empire Gary Neville's podcast empire is.
It's certainly in the stable. There's some real gems in the stable. Do you think, is this a thing? I suppose is my question. Like, is it unusual that we should be obsessed with the period of football history that happened 20 years ago? Is that normal? Is it just kind of ordinary humdrum run-of-the-mill nostalgia, or is it something else?
See, I would go with the first, to be honest. Look, Wilson's 48, you said. We're in our 40s now, and we are effectively the people disseminating this information. So it's our nostalgia as much as the audience's as well, isn't it? We would have started our careers around that period with Neville and those Man United guys before they were pundits. We were covering them. They are now in that seat, and you kind of have rose tinted glasses around that period. And we'd have to look at the people who came before. Would they be talking in similar ways as the guys you've just described? And that's probably a question.
I mean, I think if you look at who was on TV 20 years ago, it was figures from the 80s. So it was Alan Hansen, it was Mark Lawrenson. They were the main pundits.
I mean, it was literally just those two. There was no one else.
Yeah, I mean, they were clearly the main. No, they were the main two, and it wasn't as diverse as it is now. So, there wasn't as many outlets. So, Andy Gray, I guess, also, early to mid 80s player. So from that point of view, I guess it is natural. There's this sort of 20-year cycle that, 20 years after the player's been at his peak, he's a pundit. I do wonder, though, whether this is... And again, it's very hard to know, and we probably won't know this for another 20 years, people looking back on us. Imagine that. Imagine looking back on this in 20 years and think, God, that was media in 2025. But you look at that summer of 2004, and it seems to me quite a significant point in the history of the game. So 2004, also win the Champions League under Jose Mourinho. And that's the last team from outside the big four leagues. I guess PSG could join them this season, so 5 leagues to win the Champions League. That's a big moment. It's the end of one phase of football's history and the beginning of the Super Club era. You also have in the summer 2024, you have Jose and Rafa Benitez coming to English football. They both practice a sort of football which is much more controlled than what we were used to in the Premier League. Alex Ferguson has to change, and because he was exceptionally good at evolving and developing his own ideas on the game, he does change. But football changes in England in 2004. It becomes a much more controlled, cautious game. And I guess we'll come to this in the second half about this type of change and how often we should expect things to move on. Because I think that lasts 5 years, 7 years maybe, and then it changes again. And we possibly haven't moved on from that second change. So I think to look back on 20 years ago and see it as a dividing line, that feels to me not... I'm sure nostalgia colours our view of it, but I think it's also quite a significant point for English football.
You also get a year before that major figure arriving, certainly in the Premier League, and changing
Abramovich,
football.
you mean?
It's Roman Abramovich,
yeah,
of
absolutely,
course. And then everything else that brings with it.
Yeah, so I wonder if there's a reason for that period to loom large in our imaginations in a way that, like, I don't feel as though you felt as connected watching football around the year 2000, say. I don't think you felt as connected to the early 1980s. It didn't feel quite as relevant as watching football now as close as 2005 feels, say. I wonder if that's partly because 1992 did represent a cleaner break than a lot of us kind of realised at the time. And a lot of people get very angry when you kind of do anything at all to indicate that football started in 1992, and people will say, John Brewin's not here, so let's at least acknowledge his memory and say that Brewin is not a fan of the idea that football might be different post 1992. I think that's fair to say. But there's definitely a lot of people who would rightly say, like, you can't erase everything that happened before 1992. It's a totally artificial break. But then if you go through, and Wilson, you'll know this, if you go through quite a lot of football history, there's always artificial breaks. Like the Second World War, probably a more significant event than the creation of the Premier League. But a lot of records in the 70s and 80s, it was since the war. They've never won here since the war. He's scored the most goals in the first division since the war.
But that's just because it's a useful shorthand, right?
Well, exactly.
It's a sort of in what feels like modernish football.
Yeah, well,
and you could say in the last 30 years, but we have in the Premier League era, which I think for the vast majority of stats is totally the rational way of doing it. When you're saying Haaland's the greatest goal scorer of all time, I think it's interesting to say, he scored more goals in the season than anybody else in the Premier League era. Let's have a look at people who scored more in previous eras. That's a perfectly rational way of doing it. And equally, I don't know. Were people in the mid '60s sort of saying, football existed in the 1930s? They probably were, but I guess
all these Preston fans saying, well, football didn't start in 1945,
I mean, to be fair, Preston fans, for one other thing, would have had to remember 1890. And what I would remind those Preston fans, and I wish I'd been alive to tell them, is that the National League did not start until 1890. What they won twice and never won since was a regional league for the Midlands and the North West, but did not admit teams from the North East. And in their so-called invincible season, Preston beat all these teams from their region and then played a friendly against Sunderland, who were not allowed to enter the league because they were too far away, and they lost by 4-0.
And I think we can all get on board with the idea that Sunderland shouldn't be allowed to enter Leeds because it's too far away. That feels like a logical approach to take. Well done, the Victorians. So if we've established that period around football, and we will come on to the football, like the more pure football side of it later, if we've established that period is maybe unusually significant in terms of the characters that were being introduced, the changes that were happening to English football, like that is a watershed moment around the early 2000s. Is there also a thing that makes it more culturally impactful than it might be, to do with how the game was being covered? Because it does strike me that in that first decade of this century, you not only still have, newspapers are still potent things in terms of creating characters and kind of constructing narratives around football. The newspapers still had a role to play in a way that I'd argue they probably don't anymore, to be perfectly honest. You also have the birth of social media towards the end of it, so you can see and gauge and to some extent like measure the growth of the Premier League, the popularity of the Premier League in a way that wasn't possible before. And that gives the main characters of that age much more cut through than maybe would have been technologically possible 10 years previously. So I think if you look back on the players who kind of defined that era, it's not just Mourinho. It's John Terry and Drogba and Scholes and Neville and Lampard and Gerrard and Rooney and all these names that still loom really large, despite the fact that, I mean, I don't know how old you'd have to be now to really know who John Terry was, but I'm guessing it starts with a 2, to be perfectly honest. Like, I don't think if you're a teenager, I don't think you'd have any. Well, my nephew's 15, 16. He will never have seen John Terry play. But these characters are, partly through the kind of various podcast platforms that they've established, the media empires they've all got, like these are like hugely outsized characters in the drama of football even now, which does seem slightly odd to me.
Well, but what's interesting about all those people you just named, I don't know if you're doing this deliberately, they're all English. And I think one of the reasons why Mourinho and Benitez turning up in the summer 2004, okay, we'd had Wenger, but that's the first time where you get, Wenger's pre-history was unusual in that he was coming from Japan. He wasn't coming from a top European job. 2004, you get 2 of the biggest managers in Europe. The people who've literally just won the Champions League with Porto, the UEFA Cup with Valencia. He's won 2 league titles with Valencia, which, okay, if he did it now, it would be a genuinely mind-blowing achievement. But even at the time, it was an enormous achievement. Got 2 of the best coaches in the world turning up in England. That didn't used to happen. So that's another reason why it's so significant. Sorry, Tariq.
So it also tracks the financial rise of the Premier League, doesn't it? So this isn't the first time we had foreigners in the Premier League. You look at towards the late 90s, you have that Zola, Hullet, you have that generation. But they were there because, oh my God, we could get these players. But they were kind of older and coming to the end of their careers in some aspects. It was, what will the Premier League become? And that point in time that you've just described there, it's the Premier League has arrived. It's not, this is an option. It was almost like the option. This is where everyone wanted to come and to win. That's that moment, which is slightly different, I'd say, to the Hullet, Zola, and that first bit of exotic Ravanelli, that first bit of kind of exoticism in English football, I'd say. Now you've got the best managers and the best players playing also to these full stadiums in a kind of cultural era which we're still living through, where the Premier League is the international league. And I think that's that trajectory. It wasn't that first bit where Zola and Hullet were.
Sure, but the point that Rory makes about why do people like Gerrard and Lampard and Terry loom so large now is because they're still around. Whether they're doing punditry, whether they're in coaching jobs, whether they're in managerial jobs, they're still here. Whereas the people sort of, even 5 years after them, a lot of them weren't English. So actually, some of them are here. You have people like Thierry Henry, has been a pundit on British TV, now a pundit in the US. But it's at least as likely they'd return home or go somewhere. They're not as attached to England as a Rooney or a Lampard or a Terry would be.
Who is the former? Was it Habib Bey, who does a lot of punditry on French TV?
Former Villa Senegalese fullback. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't go to as many games as I used to, but I remember occasionally you'd be walking through like a press room at Arsenal and be like, "Who's that guy? I really recognise that guy." And he'd be like, "Oh my God, it's Habib Bey." And he's now, I think he's a pundit. I'm sure he's very good for French TV or maybe for North African TV. I'm not sure. Francophone television. And I wonder how many of that generation of kind of Barclaysman, like journeyman foreign player, that maybe this same thing is being kind of replayed or played out again.
I think it is.
Senegal and stuff, yeah.
I have bumped into Yusuf Chipo. And again, this is the kind of beinization as well of football, being media group. So if you were a French-speaking and Middle Eastern player who's been in the Premier League, you've got these roles, and I think being in the Premier League at that moment has given them that platform as well. I think you're right, Rory.
Well, so that must be to do with the cut through. It must be to do with the fact that by that stage, by the time the mid 2000s, say 2003, if we're dating it from Abramovich, to say 2010, just as it's a round number, by the time that rolls around, all the TV deals are in place. You have kind of the Premier League being beamed into homes across the world, having this real kind of cultural cachet, at the same time as football itself. And this is a line from, is it Goldblatt, that it's the most, or is it Tom Holland?
We both said it.
It's someone you play cricket with.
I don't play cricket with Goldblatt. I do play cricket with Tom Holland.
Is he any good?
Both said it.
Is Tom Holland any good?
He's seeing a Bulgarian personal trainer called Simon, who's turned him into a monster. It's incredible, the physical transformation. I'm told he's put on a yard of pace.
Interesting. Well, it's the summer's coming around, so you might well be facing his fearsome deliveries.
He took Simon to the Villa PSG game as a thank you.
Is that right?
Yeah.
That is. Do you know what? People should really stay for the sort of media details that we can provide on this podcast. I wonder if it's partly to do with that cut through, ability to cut through in a way that in the 90s, even the late 90s, probably was much harder. And then by the end of the decade, when you have Chelsea winning the Champions League, that was 2012, but United beating Chelsea in Moscow, United losing to Barcelona, you've suddenly got football as this kind of, what Goldblatt and Tom Holland describe as the greatest kind of popular pastime that the world has ever known.
I don't think it's popular pastime. I think it's the greatest cultural mode.
Yeah.
I
think that's true. I would agree with that. Not least
as
I work in football.
Literature or music or anything that has the cut through football does now, to a degree that's genuinely bizarre. It was always sort of a staple in the 1980s adverts of I don't know, somebody washing up in the middle of the Amazon, and suddenly kind of Bobby Charlton, Bobby Charlton, ha ha ha. But now it's genuinely like that, right? I mean, I've told this story a million times, and people are probably bored of it, but that's never stopped me before. I was in Ethiopia in 2015 and went to watch Chelsea v Liverpool and then Swansea v Arsenal in these video halls in this village in Ethiopia with like enormous audiences. There was something like a quarter of the entire village was in these video halls just watching the Premier League on a Saturday afternoon. That's just what they do.
Same. I've got similar story, different African video hall. But again, it does tell you about the cut through of also certain teams in certain areas. It was Arsenal, Chelsea around that same period. And both of those teams were incredibly popular with the West African population. Drogba at Chelsea made a huge impact. And just watching this, I was in somewhere in southern Senegal at the time. I couldn't believe it. Just absolutely rammed. You pay your 10 safer. You're in this place. People were going nuts for these players as well. And particularly, not if you score a goal or attack or anything like that. If you could meg someone, or as the kids say now, if you could skill someone, the place just erupted. And it's incredible. And this is a game It's being played in West London somewhere, making everyone just go nuts for it. And it felt, like you say, a real cultural moment based in England.
But the thing that really struck me was Swansea got a free kick, and I know we can't really talk about them these days, but Gylfi Sigurdsson steps up to take it. And the whole place, I mean, mainly Arsenal fans. I think Arsenal and United seem to be the two big teams in Ethiopia. And there's this real, Gylfi Sigurdsson, and everybody knew Gylfi Sigurdsson's good at free kicks. And it occurred to me then, like, what other Icelandic person can set a room of Ethiopians ablaze with fear? No Viking chieftain ever had that, not in Ethiopia. Like, Gylfi Sigurdsson's the most famous Icelandic person who ever lived.
I mean, the way things have gone, not great. Yeah, I mean, I remember having this conversation with someone, I think at the NYT, Tariq, and like really having to explain to them that I think you can make the case that Cristiano Ronaldo is more famous than Jesus. In terms of like
go down?
Gabriel Jesus.
Certainly Gabriel Jesus, and possibly noted religious figure Jesus. And obviously we're doing this on the Tuesday after Easter, so probably don't want to be kind of bad-mouthing Jesus. But, you know, in terms of the sheer fame of Cristiano Ronaldo, like, there is a good chance Cristiano Ronaldo is the most famous person on the planet. And for that to be a footballer is genuinely astonishing. He's far more famous now than Pele was at his pomp, or than Maradona was at his peak. Whether you think they're better players or not is irrelevant. Cristiano Ronaldo is an insanely famous person. And there must have been something in that formative era of, 2000, 2010, when Ronaldo comes through, when Messi comes through. It's not just their brilliance on the pitch, because Maradona didn't build a culture for that same culture for football. It must be a mixture of economic change, technological change, cultural change that leads to football becoming this thing that is so, like you say, Wilson, like absurdly popular, really, like probably too popular. And the one other thing that I think might be relevant is it does feel as though all that happened before, like, the complete fragmentation of culture that we see in lots and lots of spheres now, but I think applies to football as well. I think more and more football coverage, we're going to do an episode on this at some point, more and more football coverage is inherently partisan. More and more football kind of support is siloed into individual club, like, arenas, like imprisoned by their tribal loyalties. Whereas in the 2000s, I think that process hadn't happened yet, or it hadn't happened quite so starkly yet, which meant that they had a fame. You think about those Clásicos at the end, like in between in the Guardiola Mourinho era, like everyone was watching those Clásicos. There was none of this kind of, well, I only watch the Premier League, or
it's like, also, I mean, I don't know which is cause and effect here. They were much easier to watch.
Yeah,
they're just on Sky, so you could watch them without having to take out some subscription to some Scandinavian, streaming service, which never seems to work, and which. So I mean, like,
there goes the sponsorship deal with Viaplay.
Fine. But in my experience, we get about a third of it about 8 weeks late.
There was one other thing I wanted to touch on before we kind of move on a little bit, which is, and this is very much, we started off with Wilson complaining about his health, which is the sign of a man in his mid-40s.
Late 40s, let's be honest.
Let's say mid, Jonathan. Let's just say mid. Is it fair to say that maybe some of the characters then were a little bit more outsized? It does feel, most players now, it does feel as though everything is, ironically, in an era when you can present your true self to the public without the kind of Machiavellian middleman of the media. Everyone's quite polished and dull now, whereas, Jose Mourinho was love him or loathe him, was a genuinely compelling character.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the opportunity as well in that moment, as you've mentioned, the fragmentation of, particularly the change in social media as well. We're talking about an era where you could describe, if you can, good social media, when people wanted to be on it as well, before it all turned quite dark. And it was this moment where you can really propel people globally very quickly, and without any of this massaging and planning, as you see. In fact, there's something really interesting, a podcast, If You Speak Portuguese, that's just been launched, It's by Juca Kafuri, renowned Brazilian journalist. I think, Jonathan, you're probably familiar with Juca, and he's done this series. He's just started a podcast series on on Neymar and the idea of Neymar, the business of Neymar, and it's really not. It's on two Neymars: Neymar and his dad. His dad is this guy who has basically shepherded and masterminded this career that this ostensibly a footballer has had, but really is a cash magnet. It was all about marketing and branding, and I heard a bit of it today just before we recorded, and it's fascinating. There is a meeting in 2012 at an upscale Sao Paulo hotel in the Santander building, where the major figures in there are marketing figures. And this kid would have been, 16? And it's about planning in minute detail this journey to marketability of this player. And I've heard similar stories about others following him. You've got Mbappe and others who they're just so kind of, it's the planning around the marketing of these people, the image massaging is so different to even within that one generation that we're talking about. And I think that makes a difference.
But I mean, I'm acutely conscious of the danger of going, there's not the same characters that there used to be, because I heard my dad say that, I heard my granddad say that. It's the thing that every generation says, and we're now saying it. And I suspect every generation has said this. I think in this case it's true. And particularly look at managers. So, managers really from sort of mid-60s up until this period 20 years ago that we're talking about, managers were enormous characters. They were seen as having this sort of messianic quality. And your Shankleys, your Cloughs, your Revies, your Paisleys, your Fergusons, your Howard Kendalls, through to Mourinho and Benitez. And people like Tommy Docherty, they inspired teams through force of personality, through charisma, through wit, through humour. Football now is so data-driven, they have to be technocrats. And the chance of you getting somebody who's both charismatic and a technocrat, and I mean no disrespect to data scientists, but they are not the most charismatic people. And so, Antonio Raiola seems like a lovely bloke, but he's not going to come out with some zinger that you're going to be talking about 20 years later, as Mourinho did. Your Glasners, your Marco Silva, maybe he's just old enough, just spiky enough that he could do that. But a lot of the younger breed of managers, they're very good, but it's a very sort of business-like, scientific way of going about it. They're not doing it by being quirky and weird and odd.
But does it not kind of map onto what we've seen elsewhere? Not just elsewhere, but like every other sphere of human existence, where the availability and the preponderance of ways to project yourself in public have actually led to a much more curated, like cherry-picked image generation. So, like Mourinho, and I tried to sort of express this the other day, like, to me, one of Mourinho's great instinctive successes was that he'd obviously worked out, and I don't know whether it was deliberate or whether it was just who he was. English football runs on character. We are not really, as a football culture, and this isn't kind of the Italians do it better thing, but we're not really that bothered about tactics. And there's a bit of I said to Jonathan Wilson, author of a book about football tactics, there's a bit of a kind of...
If you read my Substack this morning, I made clear it's a book of the history of football tactics, not about the tactics themselves. Exactly,
and it's Inverting the Pyramid is a very good book. It's not your best. Your best is behind the curtain. Wilson started high and then has been descending ever since.
Well, what's your favourite of my books, Tariq?
Streltsov, I think, is something that...
Yeah. Well, anybody who's in Barcelona on Wednesday, I will be signing that at 6 p.m. at the place where you sign books in Barcelona.
I first met Wilson, I shouldn't really tell this story publicly, I first met Wilson at a refereeing course in 2008.
Yeah.
And I think that various Sunday papers had sent someone up to be like trained by refs I can't even remember what the piece was meant to be about. Like, is it hard being a ref? Yes.
So we had to sort of judge some offsides, and then like they showed us some videos. What decision would you give here? Then
Yeah.
There was a bit where we had to play kind of a game while somebody refereed. I remember putting in an awful challenge on somebody. Basically, I felt like the game was a bit too mundane. Somebody needed to go in there and throw a grenade to give a ref something to do, but it was actually quite a bad foul, and I can't remember who it was, but it ended up kind of like, actually limping quite badly. I felt.
But I remember I was genuinely starstruck to meet Wilson. It was like, oh my God, that's Jonathan Wilson. That's incredible. And then I got to know him, and that wore off. I've completely forgotten my train of thought now.
Alan Wilkie was there.
Who was?
Alan Wilkie.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
He was running it.
It was a nice day, to be fair. But, yeah, that's right. English football is not driven by tactics. So if you go to Italy, there will be, after a game, there will be an in-depth discussion with the journalists of, what were you doing with your right back? Because the managers are kind of conditioned to expect those questions. The journalists feel empowered to ask them. Plenty of English journalists will go and ask tactical questions, but the managers kind of know they don't really have to answer them here because that's not what we're necessarily in it for. There's not a huge amount of interest in it. It's always just kind of one floating, let's try a tactical question, see what happens, but it's not in-depth tactical kind of grilling. It runs much more as a soap opera. And Mourinho realised pretty early on, if not before he arrived, that what he had to do was play a character. And so I think my theory on Mourinho is that he invented the character of Jose Mourinho, played that character, and then became that character. And what you see now, like late stage Mourinho, is this kind of exaggerated, not especially appealing, quite charmless version of what he was before.
You say that, and I broadly agree with you, but I was in Istanbul last month for Fenerbahce against Rangers, and his post-match press conference was incredible. I sort of suddenly was like, oh my God, this is what it used to be like. When you went into a press conference and the manager actually entertained you and said ridiculous things. And then, that was the press conference where he pretended to fall asleep because one of the questions was too long. It was just his sort of overt hostility to the press was so invigorating, and the charm and humour with which he was hostile to the ones he actually hated. Obviously, to the British media, particularly the Scottish media, there because he clearly fancies being Rangers manager for some reason. He was incredibly charming, and it was very much sort of like, look, I understand these questions. These are the real questions, not like the questions of a Turkish media who kind of I have to deal with every week. And it was. I genuinely kind of, having gone into that game thinking, oh God, what a grumpy old twat he is these days. Having experienced him, when he was waiting at the bottom of a lift in Budapest for Anthony Taylor after Roma had lost to whoever they lost to. Sevilla. Of course it was Sevilla. It was the Europa League final. Having experienced that, and I'd sort of written him up, and suddenly I was just won over by him again. It's sort of like, it would be nice to have him back because he actually makes it fun.
Well, this is it, and I wonder if that sense of fun has gone because it's been polished out of the game effectively. So I'm the same. I'm really reluctant to be like, well, there aren't any great characters in football anymore. But it's difficult to think of anyone who is that compelling. I mean, Mo Salah and Virgil van Dijk are big characters.
Where would you place Klopp then in all of this? Because everything that we're saying here talks about big personalities, big characters. But is he slightly different then from that generation?
I think that's
he's
fair,
a different
isn't it?
generation, but it's the same effect.
Yeah.
You can imagine that in 15 years' time, people are still interested in what Jurgen Klopp is doing.
I mean, I guess the problem with Klopp by the end was he'd been there for nearly 9 years, and so it's very hard to entertain people for 9 years. But yeah, that's sort of us as much as him. I think he would fit that older mould. But equally, his football wasn't tediously technocratic.
Yeah, that's true.
No, and there's something on Mourinho as well. He's impacted. His personality has impacted Real Madrid. Someone was saying the other day. Don't know what you guys think of this. So this current iteration of Real Madrid is full of victimhood. People are, even though they're massive, people are against them for some reason. I heard this. I think on Second Captains the other day. They had a journalist from Bilbao, and this guy's point of view was Real Madrid haven't always been like. This started when Jose Mourinho arrived in Madrid and wanted to create a kind of dynamic of us against them, or like where they put upon team. And it's incredible if you think how big Real Madrid as an institution is, and this guy, through his personality, seems to, God knows how many years ago he left Real Madrid, but they seem to still be behaving in the same way that Mourinho imparted upon them all that time ago.
Well, I mean, it seems absurd now, but Real Madrid used to have this concept of seniorio, so gentlemanliness. I mean, Matt Busby said we Manchester United have to conduct ourselves in the manner of Real Madrid because they show us how we should behave. I mean, that would be an absurd thing to say now. I mean, I think Perez maybe had tendencies that way anyway, but yeah, Mourinho's clearly sort of amplified that.
Do you think, I've always assumed that like Real Madrid's weird victim complex, which is best exemplified by their mad insistence that they're the victims of a refereeing conspiracy, which we talked about, I think, in Libero episode 3, maybe, or 2. One of them. Go and look back. Listen to them all again. Is just because that is kind of how the modern world is constructed now. Like, you automatically claim that you're the victim, you claim that there's a conspiracy. In a way, it'd be great if all of that started with Jose Mourinho, if we could blame him for... Like, it's not just that he's changed Real Madrid's DNA, he's changed, like, global politics. So
I think this might be true. I mean, I remember even when he was back at Chelsea, even 2004. I remember writing a piece. I think maybe I said it on a podcast.
Not in 2004.
Yeah, well, sorry. Later, when I was already looking back,
you said it on a gramophone.
Maybe sort of 10 years ago, 15 years ago. This idea of sort of the footballification of the world, that suddenly everybody has their silo, and if you are a particular type of voter, you'll only consume one type of media. You will completely denigrate any opposing opinion. If you were pro-Brexit, you would just sort of laugh off any statistic produced by the Remain campaign. You would sort of revel in their defeat without ever sort of looking at any issues. It became about my side winning, not about the actual issues. And I think that begins in football. I mean, you can say Fergie does it to an extent, but Mourinho takes it to new levels.
There's a brilliant book called Ringmaster by a journalist called Abraham Josephine Reisman, which I'd recommend to everybody. It's about the life and times of Vince McMahon, the WWE impresario and now disgraced. I'm not going to libel anybody just in case, but he's had a rough year, Vince. He's not someone we talk about very much anymore. But
his
it's
wife
all about
is the education secretary.
Yeah, Linda McMahon, his wife, is Trump's education secretary, and the book's mainly a biography of McMahon, but it also goes into this fascinating aspect, which is the wrestlingification of US politics. And I think you can absolutely make the case that the same thing has happened. That football has equally served as like a canary in the coal mine. It has blazed the trail. A lot of the techniques you now see being applied politically, culturally, socially, probably do have their roots in football. I remember writing for the NYT ages ago a piece on how the football transfer market was the first ever real sort of venue for fake news. That's where, like, not only was there fake, there's always been fake news everywhere, but like it's actively welcomed in the transfer market. Like fans and journalists, to be honest, I'm the same. Like Liverpool transfer rumours are now starting to flick up on my timelines and stuff. And there is part of you that it's like you get the little dopamine hit in your brain. You start fizzing. Oh, what if they sign him? What if they sign him? Within that, there is this sort of understanding and expectation and delight in the fact that a lot of it's just bollocks, and we kind of want that. We're happy to believe the bollocks because the bollocks is exciting. Ultimately, I don't know if that works as an episode title.
Part of the entertainment. There's a great story. I won't name the broadcaster, but there was one of Chelsea's first tours after Abramovich, I think, had bought the team.
First tours, you said? First tours. Yeah, good.
Somewhere in the Far East, and a group of journalists. That's right. They had a briefing with the press officer there, and he said, "Yeah, it's gonna be a big summer here." And he said, "Will you give us some names?" And he didn't. He just said, "Well, you think all the big ones? Yeah, we'll be in for all of them." And so they decided to basically make up a bunch of names. And then a few minutes later, a broadcaster goes on and says, "Yeah, we've got this exclusive news that Chelsea are in for these 4 players. The 4 players these guys have just absolutely made up as fact." And that speaks to your story there but it was all fine. Also,
yeah, no, mind
the
it.
the fake news in football actually works because it kind of serves everyone. It makes a club look ambitious. It makes a player and his agent feel good, like we're in demand. And, the club that, if it doesn't sell them, we manage to retain this great talent. So it's one of those situations where everyone's happy for the news to come out.
We have got way off topic, which is because I lacked Jose Mourinho's leadership credentials. So let's take a very brief, quite late break, and we will return and talk about some actual football. Welcome back to Libero with me, Rory Smith, now of The Observer, Jonathan Wilson and Tariq Panja. We've been trailing this through the episode, really. We did just want to touch on kind of something similar to the themes we've been talking about, but within the actual sport of football itself. Jonathan, you will correct me on bits where I'm wrong here, but to me, football's always been partly cyclical. Like a team or a manager comes up with an innovation, other teams copy it. If it works, it becomes popular, and then someone else kind of comes along and says, well, the way to counteract that is to do this. And so you get spells of total football and kind of expansive, attractive ground football, followed by, positions of maximum opportunity, something a bit more defensive. It's kind of there's a call and response to football history. It feels to me as though one of the characters from that kind of early 2000s period that we've been discussing, Pep Guardiola, it feels to me as though he's kind of frozen football in time a little bit, that we have been in this Guardiola era now for, well, to be honest, for about 16 years, which by the span of football history is pretty long. Is that right? Am I right to think that he's got this like conceptual dominance that's not shifting, that's not being challenged? And if I am right, why is that happening?
I don't think it's not being challenged. I think it's just being challenged in a slightly different way to what we're used to. So, cyclical, I slightly chafe against, because that implies we're just going around in circles, whereas actually every time we go round on that circle, we know it went before. So it's more of a helix than a cycle.
That is it's more of a helix, says Wilson. Come on.
There's your episode title. It's more of a helix. I gave a 3-hour lecture at the University of Derby on this. I mean, it then took them 9 months to pay me.
Another title.
Just doing it on purpose now. Can you imagine a 3-hour lecture of Jonathan Wilson using the word helix? It'd be awful.
I said helix. But anyway. But I think the reason why the Guardiola innovation, revolution, is so revolutionary, or the reason that we haven't really moved on from it, is that it is so revolutionary. And I think it's probably one of the great ruptures in the game. Now you can say it's total football reimagined for 40 years later, 35 years later, and there's an element of truth to that, which bears out the point about the helix. But I think football was ready for the innovation in a way that meant it could sort of take over everywhere. And when I say that, I mean things that aren't really to do with tactics. So pitches, I think, had got loads better by, let's say, 2008, because that's when Guardiola gets the Barcelona job. And what that means is you're not, if you're receiving a pass, you're not worried about your first touch at all. You're not having to think, is that going to bobble? You don't have to concentrate on the ball. Your first touch can be taken for granted. And once that happens, the game becomes much more like chess. All you're thinking about is position on the pitch, into movements. Your 5-10 yard pass is not a threat at all. You can just move the ball, and so this is a huge moment in football's development. And I guess the only vague similarity you'd say post Second World War will be at some point in the early 60s, players suddenly get fitter, and that's probably to do with post-war rationing coming to an end. It's partly to do with just sports science getting better. It's probably to do with drugs in certain areas. And that allows teams to press with far greater intensity for far longer than ever before. So pressing becomes a sort of real feature of the game from the mid-60s onwards. And that's a huge split, pre-pressing and post-pressing. But I think what happens in 2008 is something similar, that it's controlling the ball just is no longer a worry. And you look down the levels. I was at a seventh tier game 4 or 5 years ago, and they're passing out from the back. And I sort of asked, well, how long's this been going on? And it said, well, since they got the hybrid pitch in the school. Because the hybrid pitch means that kids are growing up playing on great pitches, so why would they not do what they see on TV and pass out from the back? So everybody now does it, and that's completely changed football from being a game of position to being a game of possession. What we're starting to see, I think, is a pressing regimens, pressing systems are becoming so sophisticated that that's beginning to change again, and possibly we're going back to big centre forwards playing over the press, going a bit longer. But I think Guardiola himself has sort of done that. One of the unusual things is that the revolutionary also has the capacity to evolve over Ferguson. So Ferguson wasn't a tactical revolutionary. There's nothing Fergie did for the first time. He saw other people doing it and he thought, I can use a bit of that. Other tactical revolutionaries, so look at something like Sacchi, who completely changed Italian football. He's a very intense man who sort of burns out in 4 or 5 years. But B, he doesn't have a second idea. His second idea is to do the first idea harder. Whereas Guardiola keeps changing. So, he's had his phase with the 4 centre-backs across the back 4. Haaland means he has to play differently. He's now talking about the way that Bournemouth or Newcastle or Liverpool play as being the future because they have a bit more freedom on the wings. That their wingers are allowed to run at players. There's less control, but the amount of control that he'd insist upon had become a bit predictable in certain circumstances, which is why it felt like a classic Guardiola style had faded. So why are we still in thrall to the Guardiola revolution? A, because it's such a big revolution, and B, because he's managed to adapt in a way the revolutionaries very rarely do. You're on mute, Rory.
This is all bringing back bits of like history A-level that I don't fully understand, but is that not what like Chairman Mao wanted, like permanent revolution? Is that not the idea? Guardiola is always, whatever you think Guardiolismo is at any one point, it is already becoming something else. I mean, I remember seeing a Klassiker at Dortmund with his Bayern team, and I think Bayern won 3-0, and they did it by just booting the ball over, not booting the ball.
Javi Martinez up front.
Yeah, Javi Martinez up front. They went over the press, and that was the full kind of heavy metal Jurgen Klopp Dortmund press. There was no, like, looking back, you could say it maybe wasn't that refined a weapon, Klopp's press at Dortmund, but Guardiola clearly didn't fancy it, even with the players he had at Bayern. Just bypassed it completely, and I think you've seen that with City a lot in the last few years, that they will go over the press. That's why Ederson is their goalkeeper, so they can go over the press. And he is, maybe Guardiola is the one true revolutionary then, because he's permanently looking to change.
He's Trotsky, but Trotsky if he hadn't met Stalin.
Let's hope that he doesn't have the same denouement to his career as Trotsky. I'm sure he won't.
The World Cup 2026, when he takes Spain on a short-term deal, wakes up in the Mexico City hotel with an ice pick in his head. What a story that would be.
It would.
No characters. Who needs characters?
The assassination of Pep Guardiola. Yeah, we're just to be clear, we're not condoning this. We don't want that to happen. We're still quite sad about
and if you
Trotsky.
are studying for your history A-level, this is also the pod for you. So,
exactly. Do you think that what Forest have done this season maybe helps a little bit? Because that, to me, would indicate that that's proof of concept for there being another way. Does Forest a very, very un-City? Probably more so than any other like successful team. You can see even in like Emery's Villa, there's elements of what Pep does. There's elements that have been learnt from Pep. I'm sure there are with Nuno, but Forest are very much, let's see if we can get Anthony Elanga to sling the ball onto Chris Wood's head. That is a big part of Forest's armoury. And it's felt to me for a while as though that, we might be due a little bit more of that. There's this thing in Holland where every so often a Greek striker will finish as leading scorer. And there'll be some Greek guy who scored 9 goals in 37 games for Panionios and has gone on loan to FC Utrecht and suddenly scores 24 in 28 and gets a move somewhere and turns out to be shit, or at least not great. And it's basically, someone explained to me in Holland once, in fact Arnold Brugink, if you remember Arnold Brugink, once explained to me that the reason it happens is that all the young defenders in Holland are trained to play beautiful football. They're all ball-playing central defenders. They are 17, 18-year-olds who are all incredibly technically gifted, and they've come up through a youth system that prioritises technical football. And then they get into the Eredivisie, and the one thing, like their kryptonite, the one thing they can't handle is just a massive Greek man. And so if you're a mid-table Dutch team, you will go and sign a massive Greek man to score headers for you. And it does feel to me as though we reached the stage, I guess, or it feels to me like we have reached the stage, or we ought to have reached the stage, where that applies much more broadly, that if you played two big strikers up front, I'm not sure most central defenders would have the slightest clue what to do with them. I don't think most teams are set up to do that. But then I guess the reason that can't happen is because it is an inherently much less reliable way to attack, and football is so data-driven that most clubs have got someone in the background saying, don't do that, it's a bad idea.
This is the Ray Clark story, isn't it? Do you aware of Ray Clark?
Who is Ray Clark?
Ray Clark was this very bizarre player who went from Mansfield to Sparta Rotterdam in the 70s. Did quite well at Sparta Rotterdam. Ajax signed him. He's the first English player ever to play for Ajax, and he banged in 20 odd goals in one season. And basically that was all he ever did in his career. But his career path was Mansfield, Sparta Rotterdam, Ajax, because he was a big bloke the Dutch defenders couldn't deal with. So this is the Helix, the Ray Clark Helix.
So the Wout Weghorst experiment though didn't seem to work. Was that something different at Man United? People listening might be thinking, wasn't there a massive guy playing up front for Man United not that long ago? Why did that not work?
Well, I'm guessing that he wasn't being crossed the ball because they were playing him with inverted wingers. So if you have inverted wingers, your fullback might cross it, but your fullback's probably crossing it low. That's what they're all taught to do now: is put it in low, and in the corridor of uncertainty. I don't remember Weghorst being given a huge amount of chances to sort of sling himself high at the ball. But yeah, you are right. Also you could maybe make the argument that Wout Weghorst just isn't that good.
Well, also it's Manchester United. It's Manchester United we're talking about. Like none of the realistic rules apply.
That's true. Yeah.
They can make any player look shit.
I saw an amazing thing on my, like, how Twitter's become this ridiculously distorted lens now, and you just do all this stuff that is not relevant to you in any way and you don't want. But I saw it was like an account called like United era 007 or something, and the little tag was, name a player that who you didn't realise how much you'd missed them until they'd gone. And it was a little compilation of Cavani's goals for United, and the guy was saying, I really miss Edinson Cavani, and he missed him so much that he'd misspelt his first name. It was Edison, not Edinson. And I just thought that really summed it up, that you miss someone so much you can't remember what they're actually called. But Cavani scored a few headers for United, to be fair. And it may well be that the other factor is that everything is linked, as we have established, that if the academies aren't producing players who can score headers, which I suspect they're not, then the players who are coming through, who are the big strikers, will always be technically inferior to the small, nippy, smart ones.
Yeah, the Newcastle Arsenal game earlier this season, when Anthony Gordon got the ball on the right and crossed it for Isak to score, that just looked such an incredible goal. And yeah, I reckon 85% of all goals scored in England between 1945 and 1992 were scored like that, and 2002 were scored like that. But the idea of somebody being on the right side and crossing the ball with their right foot and it curling away from a keeper onto the head of the player running onto it.
But should that not now be a competitive edge? Are you not surprised? I am slightly surprised we don't see more managers saying, actually, do you know what? Just for 20 minutes in the second half, we're going to put the winners on the right on the right sides.
If it can cross.
Maybe that's it. Maybe they're not trained to cross, and maybe the strikers in the middle aren't trained to head it. Maybe that's the problem.
But yeah, just on your fitness point earlier on as well. I think that's enormously massive as well in all of this, isn't it? We're seeing this PSG team, for example. We're going to talk about PSG in a few weeks. Or in a few days, hopefully, on another pod. But the pressing element of PSG, not only up front, but the two games against Liverpool in particular, I haven't seen a team get four people around the ball, wherever it is on the pitch. And they went into extra time and then penalties. And it is remarkable. I mean, just to go for an average person to do a 5K run around the block, you're absolutely heaving. These people are playing 2 games a week, or maybe it's the function of the French league. Maybe they're playing 1.5 games a week. But the intensity of the press all over the pitch, that makes a massive difference.
Well, and that's why there was a lot of stuff about Kvaratskhelia, what a great throwback. Well, it may be in sort of the way he looks, his sort of style of running with the ball. But he does an enormous amount of work off the ball that, say, Chris Waddle, who's a player he seems to keep on being compared to, Chris Waddle wouldn't have done that. No, the reason why PSG look good isn't that they've suddenly gone back to kind of having old school wingers. It's that they've actually got wingers who can run, and wingers who, people like Doué, Barcola, Kvaratskhelia, who actually put in the work, and even Dembele to an extent. I mean, less so than the others, but work in a way that Neymar never did, work in a way that Mbappe never did.
This is giving away our content for Friday's episode, Tariq. We'll be doing an episode on PSG on Friday. I would love to know who is comparing Kvaratskhelia to Chris Waddle. That feels like it might be drawn from a sample of people who live in Jonathan Wilson's house.
No, I saw it online, so not even that reliable.
It was on the socials. That's probably the best place to leave it. Thank you to Jonathan and to Tariq, and thank you to you all for listening. Please feel free to rate and review and subscribe. Tell your friends. Word of mouth is a very powerful thing these days about Libero. It's the only way we get to keep on doing this, and I think we all enjoy it. There is an email for you to send your questions, your queries, your subject suggestions to. It is liberopodcast0@gmail.com. We will be back on Friday, as advertised, talking about PSG and something else. Thank you for being with us.